Again, I won't take very long, but quickly, the music, of course, the British never understood. Fortunately, they left it alone. And so the only concern for the British musicologists is why can't Indian music be annotated? Why can't we have staff notation? So they spent all their time trying to find staff notation which would try to capture it into some kind of a scientific format, which they could, which would give it a scientific this. And the real human problem for them about the Indian problem is that they had seen other ancient cultures. They had seen Egypt, they had seen Greece, they had seen Mesopotamia and so on. In all these ancient cultures, music was lost. But they had come to India and there was another ancient culture where music was not lost. So if the music was still alive and still continues, then there must be something wrong with it. That was the conclusion drawn by you. William Jones and others, they were the musical mode of the Hindus, if you look at it. And, there's always this feeling that there was a pristine music, Hindu music, which was spoiled by the British, and the British brought it down and they corrupted it and so on. And this is quite extraordinary considering that it's the 18th and the 19th century that Indian music really comes into its own. That's when, because the Mughal emperor collapsed, the empire collapsed. Another hangover we got from the British, I think it comes from the British, it may be an Indian hangover, is that collapse of empires are always, collapsing of empires is always bad. No, it isn't always bad. In fact, collapsing of empires is often very productive. And people have not looked at how productive the collapse of the Vijayanagar Empire was for South. I mean, if you go to Bharatanatyam, if you go to the Carnatic music and so on, they all arise from the fact that these artists fled from Hampi to Tanjore. And the same thing happens when the Mughal Empire collapses. And all these musicians and so on spread, and in small states you get music, and music really flourishes in the 19th century. What doesn't flourish, of course, is dance. I won't go into that long story. I'm sure you all know the attempts to ban it in 1920s, the anti-Notch movement, and ultimately the Madras Music Academy. The interesting thing about music in India is that the Indian National Congress was very early in capturing the nationalist importance of music. Right from 1892, the Indian National Congress, they always had they had a session of music, and they were upper class caste women were encouraged to sing in music. So music was always associated with the new nationalism that was coming up in India, and women and other classes were trying to bring it up. And in 1927, when the Madras was the venue of the conference of the Indian National Congress, they founded the Madras Music Academy. And the Madras Music Academy went on not only to save music, but went on also to pick up dance. In 1932, E. Krishna Iyer took up what was then considered the correct form of dancing and turned it into Bharatanatyam. As you know, I'm sure most of you know that the word Bharatanatyam is not ancient as it's claimed, but really goes back to 1932, when it was officially adopted by the Madras Music Academy, E. Krishna Iyer. But again, what happens is, as it becomes, as dance and music become adopted, they are adopted by the upper caste. And when I was there in the 1960s, by that time it was very interesting. There were three women who represented Indian culture, the cultural scene, and it was very interesting to see them. One was Bala Saraswati, the great dancer. She was Devdasi, and she refused to kowtow to the Brahmin establishment, and she remained separate and suffered for it. She suffered for it so much that she didn't even teach dancing to her own daughter, Lakshmi, who started learning very late, because she told me, Bala told me, I knew her very well, that enough is enough, I think I have suffered for it. The other thing was Subbulakshmi. Now, Subbulakshmi and Bala were both from the Devdasi class, and the recent history of Subbulakshmi has a photograph which shows Bala and Subbulakshmi both smoking cigarettes. They are about 15 years old and they are smoking cigarettes and so on. But Bala was married, he was picked up, married, well, I suppose. Sadashivam, the great Congress wheeler dealer, let me put it, and leader and so on. What Sadashivam did was to turn her into an object of art. And when I met Subbulakshmi was the essence of Brahminism. I mean, she dressed like a Brahmin woman, she spoke like a Brahmin woman, she sang like a Brahmin woman. It's said that Brahmin women looked at her to learn how to behave like a Brahmin woman. And I had, actually Ashok Nehru is here and he took me one day to I hope you'll allow me to be an entertainer for once this evening, which is Ashok Nehru took me to a function which was at Subbulakshmi's. I think it was her daughter's wedding. And we went and we were sitting there and Bala came, Bala Saraswati came and Subbulakshmi came and a scene took place which went something like that. Bala said, Wango. And Subbulakshmi said, Wanda. And Bala said, And it went on like two Japanese laughing at each other. Then they suddenly burst out laughter and jumped into each other's arms and laughed and so on. But for that one moment, the tension that was there in the air, and the whole historical conflict, two Devdasi women, one Brahminized, one completely non-Brahminized, completely women, sort of confronting each other, came out alive. That was quite extraordinary. And the third person who was interesting in that, this was in fact Rukmini Devi Arundel, who was a Brahmin woman, who married a non-Brahmin, and the strength of his built the Kalakshetra, and then took Bharatnatyam and Brahminized it. In fact, you could say about Rukmini Devi that she did to Bharatnatyam what Bala did to her, what Subbulakshmi did to herself. She completely Brahminized it and she threw out all the Devdasi teachers, they threw out all the students. No Devdasi students were there. I think Leela Samson, who's Jewish by religion, is practically one of the very, very few people who actually learned Bharatanatyam because the traditional Devdasi students were completely discouraged from coming into Kalakshetra. Of course, this is not to run her down, whatever the political situation. Retrospective judgment is always rather dangerous. But the fact is, it's interesting that these three women, in a way, represented the Brahminism and non-Brahminism culture in South Canada. So now let me sum up quickly. I don't know whether I've gone on or not, but to sum up succinctly, what I think is how I would look at the art scene, the general culture, what might we call all those forms which created rasa, if I may come back to it, because I think the whole concept of rasa to be confined to theatre sort of limits it very much. It's in a way our equivalent of culture, I think. And I will just, you see, out of the colonial encounter, the forms that came out best, I think, and strong were music and dance. This is because the colonial encounter weakened the caste system, and therefore the caste barriers that stood in the way of young women and men going into the art forms collapsed. And the arts opened out in different directions. And I think it's really not an exaggeration to say that today dance and music, Indian dance and music, are better, richer, more creative than ever before in the history of India. There are more artists today, there is more experimenting going on, there is more vitality there. Of course, there is more grumbling also. Of course, that's a part of the vitality. I think we are living through a golden age. And that golden age still continues because it started only about 20 to 30 years ago with independence. That's one thing. The art forms that suffer were the visual art forms. One was the painting, as I said. Architecture, of course, because no Indian was. The British decided that they wanted to teach their architecture to India, and they taught their architecture. And in the 20th century, two huge cities were being built in India. One was, first it was New Delhi, Lutyens and Herbert Baker, and traditional Indian architects were used only for menial work. Everything was done, except for a little decoration here and there to bring Western concept of architecture here. And then when we became independent, of course, we wanted to build Chandigarh, and what happens? We again go back to Corbusier, and he comes and Nehru tells him, do something that has not been done traditionally. And he literally does that, with whatever is left there as Chandigarh at the moment. So, it's really, Indian architecture really comes back only in the 70s and the 80s. It's from the disciples of Louis Kahn and others, people like Charles Correa, who really look back and again say, what have we lost? The interesting point is that the tradition, this I was told by Louis Kahn, but also was that what was lost of the traditional Indian architecture? A simple thing like, how is an arch made without cement? What kind of, if you go to those Alibag Fort and so on, you see the bricks are pitted by the sea wind, but the cement they used is still intact. The cement is still strong, it's still holding those pitted bricks. Now, what did they use to use that cement? I mean, this is the 15th, 16th century. You go to some of these places of worship where Ahilyabai Holkar from Indore ordered that some caravanserai has to be built. And the caravanserai is built for travelers and so on, built beautifully. Now, Ahilyabai Holkar didn't go there. She didn't send her architects. So obviously there was a whole tradition of building which got completely collapsed because the CPWD came in and the centralized form of building came in. I was shooting in Kerala in a house, and there was in Theruvadu, in an old temple, and there was a beautiful bright green floor. And I said, who made this and how? No one knew. The whole art had been lost. The ingredients had been lost, and so on. So, so far as architecture, I think, was concerned, the British experience was more or less a disaster. So, painting, fortunately, has come out of it. And then there is, of course, a few art forms which we got from them because of their technology, photography, for instance, which came and the recording of instrument music, which of course brought music out of the chords and so on and built them out. And one must remember one thing, this great richness of music that you see in the 20th century is also responsible for a lot of art forms being rich. One is films, for instance, Indian films. When I was in college, when I was at Oxford and so on, Japan had Ozu and Kurosawa, Italy had Fellini, Antonioni and so on, and France had all the others, I won't go into all those names. They all had, France had, Italy had, Japan had, and so on. We only had Satyajit Ray. And we kept saying, why aren't there more Satyajit Rays? Why aren't we like them? Now, 50 years have passed, there is no film industry in Japan. It's been eaten up by Hollywood. There's no film industry in France. That's been protected against Hollywood. There's no film industry in Italy. That's been eaten up by Hollywood. What has not been eaten up by Hollywood is Indian film industry. We are perfectly safe because we never compromised. I mean, we went our own way. And we never accepted the values of what's... In fact, I can say quite confidently that if we had followed in the path of Satyajit Ray, which I did, and my films were all songless and realistic and so on, and all that, Indian film industry would have been finished by then. But thank God for the fact that, good sense prevailed one way or another. And it's the song and the dance. And, the fact that it has its own logic. Why should we accept a logic of a painting or a visual art which goes back to chiaroscuro and perspective and medieval notions of European medieval notions of how to depict a scene. Now, Indian cinema has developed a completely different vocabulary, and it succeeds. I know we can't make a Titanic, but then they can't make Hum Aapke Hain Kaun. So this has been the extent of survival. And now, of course, to bring my survey to a quick end without losing track of rasa, because I want to insist that rasa is not only a theatrical experience. The experience of culture is the coming of electronics and the challenges that now is electronics technology, electronics an art form. It's very difficult to say. The point is, this is Ashish's sense of timing. One day I was talking to my son and I said that after independence, my generation was very lucky because when I was 12 years old, there was not even electricity in the town I grew up in. Then in the 50s, the films came. Satyajit Ray started in 1954. 55, the Hindi film industry, we had Gurudutt and Bimalo and so on and so on. Then in the 60s, the theatre, Alkazi, and others came then, and so on, and novels and so on and so on. And I said, now we have come to the 80s and I see no progress. Everything is stuck and it's not going. And my son says, now we have come to the 80s and you don't understand anything. That's what it means, because now it's all blossoming. And since then I've been paying attention, which is that it is true that it is the extraordinary thing. There's only one little fact that I would like to mention, that when the skies opened out and the satellite television came and so on, everyone thought the world was going to flood our skies. Murderization of skies was predicted. We were told that, we shouldn't allow the skies to open out and world to come in. But what happened when the skies opened out is that all the channels that came out were all in regional languages. Z came, that was the only, and Star TV came, and there was this tussle for a while in which Murdoch really lost out. But ultimately, and so that you now today, to a very, how shall I put it, a very puzzling phenomenon. On one side, because of electronics, because of our laptops and computers and so on, people, even poor people, are sending their children to English medium schools. There is a fear in places like Bangalore, I'm told even in Calcutta, that local languages may be dying out because children go only, everyone borrows only to send them to English medium school, and our children have no notion of what's going to happen to our languages, which way our culture will go. But on the other hand, it's also true that because of the television media, because of the media probably Indian languages have never been more richer, never been richer, more active. There are more actors working in Hindi films or Hindi television channels. There are more people singing. There are more women acting. More people are reached out by this media. So on one side, you may feel that the language culture is dying. Languages are dying without patronage. But on the other hand, there is a feeling. There is certainly a fact that this media has enriched our activity. We are, and which way we'll go, it yet remains to be seen. The only hope is that because of electronics, the division I mentioned earlier, which is between the city and the outside, which I think was really a colonially created division, that the continuity was broken by the values. That, I hope, will now be cemented by electronics, that it will be possible to have communication without people actually moving from villages to the cities, cities to the villages, or whatever it is, but it's a more complicated question. So let me say again, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. As I said, I'm not a scholar, and a lot of what I said must be already known to you. So, but I was only trying to work out my thoughts as I have been going through these fields. Thank you very much. Bye.